The last thing my grandmother ever gave me was a breath of cold air from inside a mountain. I did not know that at the time. I did not know much of anything at the time, except that I was 16 years old, that I owned nothing but a cloth bag and a pair of shoes that pinched my left foot, and that somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, a woman I had never met had left me something that the lawyer described as 14 acres of steep, wooded hillside, a dwelling in disrepair, and a limestone cave formation of no commercial value. I am 60 years old now. That is not as old as the world sometimes makes it sound, and not as young as my hands would have to be to do this work the way I once did it. My hands are spotted and slow from 4 decades of cave work and terrace stone and the grip of a harvest basket. And that is a different kind of age than the kind you earn rather than simply accumulate. The cave behind the cabin still breathes the same cold air it breathed the morning I first pressed my palm to the rock face and felt it. The seed bank my grandmother built holds more than 600 varieties of plants that the world had nearly forgotten. The mushroom operation my grandmother started in 1913 still supplies restaurants across 3 counties. And every March, when the hollow floods with the first green of spring, families come from across the state to the Agnes Callaway Heritage Seed Festival, and they trade seeds and stories and the names of things their great-grandmothers used to grow. I am going to tell you how all of that happened. I am going to tell you about a woman I never met who knew me better than anyone who ever looked me in the face. I'm going to tell you about what she built inside a mountain and why she sealed it shut and what she was waiting for. But first, I need to take you back to a Thursday morning in March of 1942, to a room that smelled like floor wax and old wool, where a woman named Sister Evangeline stood behind a desk and read a letter out loud to a room full of girls who did not need another reason to feel sorry for themselves. I was one of those girls. I was the one they were all looking at. The letter was from a lawyer in Mingo County, West Virginia. His name was Mr. Aldrich Fenwick. He had written to St. Anne's Home for Girls in Beckley on behalf of the estate of one Agnes Callaway, deceased formerly of Keeney's Creek Hollow, and he wished to inform the institution that the aforementioned Agnes Callaway had named her granddaughter, one Wren Marsh, age 16, as sole beneficiary of her entire estate. Sister Evangeline paused at the word estate. She let it hang in the air a moment before she kept reading, which told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. The estate Mr. Fenwick's letter explained consisted of the following: 14 acres of steep wooded hillside in Keeney's Creek Hollow, Mingo County, West Virginia, a one-room cabin in significant disrepair, a small root cellar, and a limestone cave formation located behind the cabin, described in the county land records as being of no commercial value and currently inaccessible due to extensive overgrowth. Sister Evangeline looked up from the letter. She looked at me. Then she looked at the room, and something shifted in her expression, something small and unkind that she did not quite try to hide. She read the last part again. A limestone cave formation of no commercial value, currently inaccessible due to extensive overgrowth. One of the older girls laughed first, then 2 more. Then it moved through the room like water finding the lowest point of a floor, a ripple of laughter and quiet commentary, and that sound that girls in institutions make when someone else's misfortune briefly makes them feel better about their own. I did not cry. I had stopped crying at St. Anne's around the age of 12 when I understood that tears were a currency that bought nothing in a place like that. You could spend them freely and wake up the next morning just as poor as you had been the night before. So I sat in my chair with my hands flat on my knees, and I looked at a water stain on the wall above Sister Evangeline's head, and I waited for the room to finish. My name is Wren Marsh. My mother died of pneumonia in the winter of 1938 when I was 12 years old in a boarding house in Beckley, where we had been living since my father left the year before. He was a man who came and went like weather, and when he went for the last time, he did not leave a note. My mother worked as a seamstress until she could not. When she could not any longer, the state sent me to St. Anne's and the Sisters of St. Anne spent 4 years doing their best to make me into something useful: a laundress, a kitchen worker, a future wife for some man who needed steady hands more than he needed a conversation. I was none of those things. I was the girl who stole books from the donation box and read them under her blanket by candlelight. I was the girl who asked the science teacher at the public school, where we were sent 3 days a week to satisfy the state's education requirements, whether plants could feel the difference between sunlight and reflected light, and whether a mirror could trick a seedling into growing sideways. I was the girl who kept a notebook full of drawings, root systems and seed casings, and the branching patterns of veins on leaves, who once lost 30 minutes watching a tendril of wild grape work its way around a fence post and got herself extra kitchen duties for it. I was not a girl people expected to inherit anything, and I had never heard the name Agnes Calloway in my life. That night, after the room was quiet and the other girls were asleep, I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman I had never met who had apparently thought about me enough to leave me the only thing she owned. I did not feel grateful. I did not feel much of anything except a low, steady bewilderment, the kind that settles into your chest when the world does something you cannot yet find the words for. I thought about the word estate and the laugh it had produced, and I decided that the laugh was the most honest thing that had happened that day. 14 acres of steep hillside, a cabin that needed work, a cave nobody could get into. I thought this is either the beginning of something or the end of everything. I did not know which one yet. Mr. Aldrich Fenwick arrived at St. Anne's on a Tuesday morning in a truck that smelled like pipe tobacco and old maps. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with a gray mustache he seemed to have forgotten to trim, and eyes that were sharper than the rest of him suggested. He shook Sister Evangeline's hand, signed the necessary papers, and then he walked me out to his truck without ceremony, as if transferring a 16-year-old girl to the custody of a dead woman's property were a thing he did every week. I carried everything I owned in a cloth bag over my left shoulder. 2 dresses, a change of underclothes, my notebook, a botany textbook I had stolen from the donation box 3 years ago and never given back, the shoes that pinched. We drove south and then west, and the road climbed into country that grew wilder and steeper with each mile. The trees were bare still late March, bare the kind of bare that looks final until it suddenly isn't. Ridges rose on either side of the valley, and the sky narrowed to a strip above us, and the coal trucks came the other direction in slow, heavy processions, their beds piled black. Mr. Fenwick did not say much for the first hour. He smoked a pipe with quiet concentration and kept both hands on the wheel on the curves, which came frequently. When he did speak, it was in the measured way of a man who had learned that most things worth saying did not need much decoration. He told me that Agnes Calloway had come to Keeney's Creek Hollow in 1910 as a young widow from North Carolina, that she had found the land and the cabin and had lived there alone for more than 30 years, that she had not come to town often, twice a year at most, and that she had not encouraged visitors, and that most people in the county knew of her without knowing much about her, which in that part of the world was a distinction that mattered. She grew things, he said. People knew that about her. She had a garden that other people talked about, though most of them had never seen it. I asked whether she had family besides me. He thought about that for a moment longer than the question seemed to require. No, he said, not that I know of. You're all she listed. I asked whether she had ever mentioned me. He took the pipe from his mouth and rested it on his knee and looked at the road. This is what he said. He said that Agnes Calloway had come to his office in the fall of 1939, that she had sat across from his desk for the better part of an hour, arranging and then rearranging a sealed envelope on her knee, that the envelope had a name written on the outside in a careful, deliberate hand. His name, Mr. Fenwick's, on one line, and below it in smaller letters, her instructions, to be held until my death and delivered unopened to Wren Marsh St. Anne's Home for Girls, Beckley, West Virginia. Only her. He said he had asked her then whether she wanted to explain the circumstances. She had said no. He had asked whether there was anything else he should know. She had said, give the girl time. Whatever she finds, give her time to understand it. He put the pipe back in his mouth. That was all she told me, he said. I sat with that for a long while. The truck climbed, the ridges closed in. A creek appeared beside the road, running fast and cold and clear over flat limestone shelves. I asked him what she died of. Lungs, he said. She'd had trouble with them for years. The doctor in Williamson said she'd been managing it longer than anyone should have been able to. Stubborn woman. His voice had something in it when he said that. Not quite admiration and not quite sorrow, but something that lived in the country between them. We turned off the main road onto a dirt track that became within a quarter mile more of a suggestion than a road. Two ruts in the mud cutting between stands of rhododendrons so dense the branches touched overhead and made a tunnel of them. The truck moved through it at a walking pace, branches dragging along the roof. Mr. Fenwick stopped at the end of the track, where the rhododendron gave way to a small clearing. He reached into the glove compartment and produced a key on a length of twine in a $5 bill folded once. He held them both out. "The cabin is about a quarter mile up," he said. "Follow the creek. The cave is behind the cabin somewhere in the hillside. I've never been inside. Don't know anyone who has not in recent years. The whole entrance got swallowed up by kudzu and wild grape. Your grandmother never cleared it?" I asked why not. He looked out through the windshield at the rhododendron tunnel they had come through. Like I said, he told me. Stubborn woman. Then he said more quietly, "I think she was waiting for someone to do it for her." He did not say who. He handed me the key and the $5 and shook my hand, and there was something in the handshake that felt like an apology for something he had not done and could not undo. Then he put the truck in reverse and disappeared back through the tunnel. I stood in the clearing with my cloth bag over my shoulder and the key in my hand and the creek running cold beside me, and I listened to the truck engine fade until there was nothing left of it and the hollow was quiet. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that presses in from all sides and makes you aware of your own breathing. I picked up my bag and followed the creek. The cabin appeared between the trees at a bend in the path, and my first thought was that it was smaller than I had imagined, and my second thought was that small was not the same thing as hopeless. The walls were squared timber, dark with age but solid. The roof had shed some shingles on the east side and would need attention before the rains came heavier. The chimney was stone and still straight. A woodpile under a lean-to beside the door held enough split oak to last a month at least. Someone, Agnes herself, perhaps, had stacked it neatly and covered it with oilcloth, weighted at the corners with river stones. I unlocked the door and went inside. The room was one space the way cabin rooms almost always are in that country, with a stone fireplace on the north wall and a cast iron stove beside it, and a bed in the corner and a table in the center. The floor was plank wood worn smooth in the paths between the furniture. Light came through two windows, east and west, and on every sill of every window stood jars. Glass jars of every size, their contents brown and gray and green, dried herbs and roots and seeds and bark. Some of them labeled in a hand I would come to know as well as my own, some labeled only with small symbols I did not yet understand. But it was not the jars that stopped me, it was the books. They lined the wall opposite the fireplace from floor to ceiling, on shelves that had been built carefully with patience, each shelf level and each board fitted without gaps. There were more books in that one-room cabin than I had seen in any single place, except the public library in Beckley. And these were not novels or Bibles or the kind of books that find their way into mountain cabins by accident. These were books that someone had sought out and paid for and kept. Botany, soil chemistry, mycology, plant pathology, water management. There were volumes in French and German that I could not read then, and monographs printed by state agricultural extension offices, and hand-bound collections of notes whose spines were labeled in Agnes's careful hand. There were cross-section diagrams pinned directly to the wall beside the shelves, drawn in ink on heavy paper. Root systems, fungal networks, the branching mathematics of mycelium spreading through substrate, maps of the hillside annotated with soil depth measurements and sun exposure calculations, and arrows marking the direction of underground water flow. I stood in front of those shelves for a long time. The shoes that pinched were still on my feet. My bag was still on my shoulder. I had not moved from just inside the doorway. I knew standing there that I had misjudged everything. Not just about the inheritance, though I had misjudged that entirely. I had misjudged Agnes Calloway. Whatever she was, whatever she had been, she was not the strange recluse that the lawyer's careful language and the county's amused indifference had suggested. A strange recluse does not build shelves like this. A strange recluse does not spend 30 years acquiring books in French and German and annotating maps of underground water flow. She had been a scientist, an untrained one perhaps, a self-taught one certainly, but the evidence on these walls was unmistakable. She had been a person who understood the world as a set of systems and who had spent her life studying those systems with a patience and precision that most universities would not have recognized because she had never set foot in one. I took my bag off my shoulder and set it on the floor beside the door. I took off the shoes that pinched and set them beside the bag. And then I saw the table. There was a journal on the table. Not shelved, not stored, not tucked away. Open. Left open the way you leave a book when you are only stepping away for a moment and intend to return. Except that Agnes Calloway had left it open on the last day she was able to write in it, and she had not returned. The handwriting on the open page was different from the careful hand on the jar labels and the shelf spines. It trembled. The letters were formed with effort, each one a small act of will against a body that was running out of cooperation. But the words were precise. A person whose mind is failing writes differently than a person whose hands are failing. Agnes's hands had been failing. Her mind had not. The last entry read as follows. I have read it so many times in the years since that I no longer need to close my eyes to see it. The cave holds everything. If she comes, if the girl comes, she must clear the entrance. She must see what I built. The vines are the door. What is behind them is the answer. I built it for her. I built all of it for her. I stood over the table and read those words twice and then a third time. I read them the way you read something when you are trying to decide whether it means what it appears to mean, whether you are understanding it correctly, whether the plain surface of the language is actually what is happening, or whether there is something underneath it you are missing. She had been waiting for me. A grandmother I had never met had been waiting for a granddaughter she had never spoken to, and had left her a message that read like a hand reaching out from somewhere beyond reach. I was 16 years old. I had grown up in an institution. I had learned early and thoroughly that the world did not organize itself around my benefit, that care was a transaction, that warmth had to be earned and could be revoked, and that the safest position was the one where you needed nothing from anyone. I had built my life on that understanding. And here was a dead woman telling me she had built something for me, specifically for me. Not for whoever might find the place, not for the state, not for the county, not for posterity, for me. I pulled out the chair and sat down at the table, and I pressed my palms flat against the wood, and I breathed. Then I noticed the envelope. It was propped against the side of the inkwell at the back of the table, and I had not seen it at first because I had been focused on the journal. It was a plain envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed. On the front, in that same careful hand, from the jar labels, the hand that belonged to a younger Agnes Calloway, a woman whose hands had not yet begun to fail, it said 4 words. For Wren Marsh, only her. I sat with it in my hands for a long moment. The cabin was cold. The fireplace was cold. The air smelled of dried herbs and old paper and the mineral smell of mountain stone that I would later learn to associate with the cave, because the cave was always breathing its cool breath into the hollow, and some of it found its way through the cabin walls. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages written in the same careful hand as the envelope. The ink was black, and the lines were straight and even pressed into the paper with the deliberate firmness of a person who had chosen every word before she wrote it and did not intend to revise. She began by saying she knew my name. She wrote it the way people write names they have said quietly to themselves many times. Wren. Not Miss Marsh, not the girl, not Agnes Calloway's granddaughter. Wren. As if she had been saying it for years. She wrote that she knew I was at St. Anne's in Beckley. She knew I had been there since 1938, since my mother died. She wrote that she knew about the notebook I kept the drawings of root systems and seed structures, and that she had learned this from a teacher at the public school who had noticed me and written a letter years ago to an address she had found through Mr. Fenwick's office, asking whether anyone in my family knew that the girl was unusual and ought to be given more to work with. She had received the letter. She had read it many times. I set the pages down and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and breathed. Then I kept reading. She had not answered the teacher's letter. She had sat with it for weeks, and she had thought about what it meant to have a granddaughter she had never met, who was sitting in a room full of donated books, drawing pictures of root systems by candlelight, and she had made a decision that she knew was the wrong one, and that she made anyway because she believed she did not have a choice. In the fall of 1939, she wrote, I came to Beckley. She had taken the bus. It had taken most of a day to get there from the Hollow. She had walked from the bus station to the address the teacher's letter had given her, which was St. Anne's, and she had stood outside the iron fence that ran along the front of the property, and she had waited. She had waited for 2 hours. She wrote this without apology or complaint the way a person reports a fact. 2 hours, standing. In October, she was already sick then. She did not say so in so many words, but later reading her other journals, I would understand that by 1939 she had been managing the lung trouble for 2 years and that the trip to Beckley had cost her more than she let on. I came out through the front door of St. Anne's at 3 in the afternoon, she wrote, because I had free hour on Wednesday afternoons, and I always spent mine in the side yard under the sycamore tree where there was a stone bench and where the gap in the rhododendron hedge was large enough to give a view of the hill above the creek. She had watched me come out. She had watched me sit down on the bench with my notebook and open it to a blank page and begin to draw something, tilting my head to study what I was drawing the way a person does when they are trying to get the proportions right. She wrote that she stood there for a long time. She wrote that she started toward the gate and stopped. She wrote that she did this more than once. And then she wrote what she had decided, and this is the part of the letter I have read the most times in the years since the part I have gone back to in the difficult seasons of my life to read again. She wrote it plainly the way she wrote everything, without ornament or deflection. I could give you myself, she wrote, a grandmother, a living person who would have known you and held you and answered your questions. I know what that would have meant to a girl in your situation. I am not foolish enough to believe it would have meant nothing. But I was dying Wren. I had at most 2 or 3 years, and most of that time I would need to spend working. Not for myself, for you, for what I was building. If I had taken you from St. Anne's, I would have given you a grandmother who was already leaving. I would have given you one more loss to learn to carry. I made the choice I made because I believed it was the more honest one. I hope you will forgive me for it. I hope that what I left you is worth more than the thing I kept from you. I am not asking you to love me. I am asking you to go into the cave. I folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. I set the envelope on the table beside the open journal. I sat in the cold cabin for a long time and felt several things at once. Anger was there, a clean, clear anger that needed no examination. Grief of a particular kind, the grief not for a person you knew, but for the person you did not get to know, which is its own variety and sharper than most. And under all of it, something else. Something I did not have a word for yet. Something that lived in the space between being chosen and being left, between being known and being waited for. I had grown up believing I was no one's problem and no one's project and no one's concern. That was not a complaint. It was simply the architecture of the life I had built myself, room by room, in a place where everything soft got taken from you if you left it out in the open. Agnes Calloway had stood outside a fence in Beckley in 1939 and looked at me and gone home and spent the last 3 years of her life finishing something she had started building 30 years before. For me. Not in spite of not knowing me, because of what she had seen. That made a new kind of room in the architecture. I did not know yet what to put in it. I did know what she was asking me to do. I found her tools in the lean-to beside the woodpile, a hand sickle with a blade that was rusted along the spine but still sharp at the edge, a hatchet with a hickory handle solid and heavy, a pair of leather work gloves stiff with disuse, a coil of rope, a kerosene lantern with enough oil in it to last several hours. I went around to the back of the cabin. The hillside behind the cabin rose sharply, maybe 200 feet to the ridge above, and every inch of it was covered. Kudzu had come first the way kudzu always comes, laying itself over everything in thick, ropey curtains that blanketed the lower slope from ground to canopy. Wild grape had threaded through the kudzu in vines as thick as my wrist, finding the gaps and filling them with a secondary lattice of its own. Virginia creeper covered the rock face underneath everything else, pressing flat against the limestone in a red-veined sheet that in summer would be green but in March was still dormant brown. And honeysuckle, stubborn and fragrant, even without its flowers, had filled every remaining gap. Its stems gone woody, with years of unchecked growth, knotted into cables and ropes and tangles that required more force to move than you would expect from a plant with such a gentle reputation. The hillside was a wall, a living wall. Years of growth upon years of growth upon years of growth. Each season adding another layer, another fastening, another connection between root and rock, and root until the whole thing had become something that was less a hillside, with plants on it, than a single dense organism that happened to contain a hillside somewhere inside it. I stood at the base of it for a long time. I looked at it the way my grandmother had once looked at a gate in Beckley. Then I put on the leather gloves and picked up the sickle and started. The first day I made almost no visible progress. I pulled vines and cut stems and hacked at grape canes that had gone woody to the diameter of saplings, and by the time the light failed, I had cleared maybe 8 feet of width along the base of the cliff and perhaps 4 feet up from the ground. My hands were blistered inside the gloves. My arms ached in the long muscles from wrist to shoulder. I had sweated through my dress in the morning cold, and then gotten cold in the afternoon when I stopped moving. I went inside and ate the rest of the cornmeal I had found in the cabin, cooked with creek water over the stove, and I slept the flat, used-up sleep of genuine exhaustion. The second day was harder. The blisters broke and the gloves rubbed the raw skin, and the vine stems were thicker in the middle section of the wall, where they had had more years to establish. I worked steadily. I pulled and cut and pulled again, and I piled the cut material in mounds behind me that grew taller than my head. I found the root systems of the older grapevines going down into cracks in the limestone, anchored so deeply that pulling them was less like gardening and more like excavation. I dug at them with the hatchet blade and loosened them and pulled, and sometimes they came and sometimes they did not. And when they did not come, I cut them as close to the base as I could get and moved on. That evening, walking back to the cabin along the base of the cliff, I noticed something I had not noticed before. The rock face itself, where I had cleared it, was different from what I had expected. It was not rough and irregular the way exposed limestone usually is. It had been shaped, not by water or not only by water. Some sections of it showed marks that were too regular to be natural shallow channels cut horizontally into the rock face, parallel lines spaced about a foot apart, running along the cliff in both directions from where I was standing. I touched them with my fingers. They were old. The edges were worn smooth by weather and decades of growth. But someone had made them. Someone had stood at this rock face with a tool and cut these channels deliberately. I did not sleep as well that night. The third day, the work changed. I was working along the rock face in the middle of the morning, pulling kudzu in long sheets that came away from the limestone with a tearing sound that echoed off the hollow walls when I felt it. I had my face close to the rock, both hands full of vine stems, leaning into the work, and the air that came out of the crack in the limestone hit me full in the face without warning. Not a draft, not wind, something different, something steady and purposeful, the way a breath is steady and purposeful, the way a living thing exhales without trying. The air was cold, maybe 20 degrees colder than the March morning outside, and it was damp and it carried a mineral smell, limestone and water, and something green beneath it, and it was constant pressing outward against my face with a gentle, continuous pressure. I went still. I had read enough of my grandmother's books in the 2 nights I had spent in the cabin to know what it meant. Underground air movement, a cave system large enough to generate its own pressure differential, warmer air outside drawing the cooler cave air outward through any available gap. There was a gap. I cut faster. I stopped being careful and started being urgent. I pulled vines in handfuls and did not stack them, just threw them aside and pulled more. I hacked at the grape stems without bothering to find the roots first. I ripped kudzu away from the limestone in sheets that were 10 feet wide and threw them behind me into the growing chaos of the cut pile. My hands stopped hurting. I did not notice the cold. I did not notice anything except the rock face emerging inch by inch from 30 years of green enclosure. I worked for an hour without stopping, and then the light shifted. It came through the canopy at an afternoon angle, the low March sun finding a gap between the ridge above me and the overstory trees, and for a few minutes it fell on the section of cliff I had just cleared at exactly the right angle to show what was there. A darkness in the rock. Not shadow, not a hollow or a recession, an opening. A gap in the limestone face, roughly rectangular, maybe 5 feet wide, and 6 feet tall, framed by solid rock on 3 sides, and the remnant curtain of unclean vine on the fourth. And above the opening, barely visible beneath the last layer of growth, I had not yet reached something carved into the limestone. Letters, numbers, chiseled into the stone with patient, deliberate strokes that had waited 30 years for someone to uncover them. I climbed up the pile of cleared vine stems and cut away the last of the growth above the opening and stood back. A. Calloway, 1913. My grandmother had marked this cave in the year she claimed it, the year she had first stepped inside it, and known what she was standing in 29 years before I stood outside it. She had carved her name into the stone above the door of a place she intended to spend the rest of her life building, and then she had let the world grow over it and waited. The kerosene lantern was at the cabin. I walked back to get it. I carried it the way you carry something you do not want to spill. I lit it inside the cabin where the air was still enough to keep the match alive, and I carried it back down the hillside path with both hands sheltering the flame with my body. I stood at the opening for a moment. The cold air pressed against my face. The lantern light reached maybe 10 feet into the darkness and then stopped, absorbed by the curve of the passage beyond. I thought about my grandmother standing outside a fence in Beckley in 1939, starting toward the gate and stopping, starting again and stopping again. I thought about what she had written. I am not asking you to love me. I am asking you to go into the cave. I lifted the lantern. I stepped inside. The first chamber was narrow and low and smelled like the inside of a stone. The lantern light moved ahead of me in a yellow circle that shifted with each step, throwing shadows up the walls and pulling them back again, and my footsteps made a sound that came back to me a half-second later, the limestone returning everything I gave it. The passage ran about 30 feet into the hillside, no wider than a doorway, and just tall enough to stand upright without ducking. The walls were wet. Water seeped through the rock in thin films that caught the lantern light and held it. The floor was smooth, worn flat by centuries of water moving through, and it sloped downward slightly, drawing me in the way a downhill path always does, requiring less decision than you expect. Then the passage opened. I did not see it coming. One step I was in the narrow channel, the walls close enough on either side that I could have touched both with my elbows out, and then the next step the walls were gone, and the ceiling was gone, and the lantern light that had been bouncing back to me from close surfaces suddenly went outward into space and did not return. I stopped walking. I held the lantern up. The chamber was enormous, not large in the way that rooms in fine houses are large, with their proportioned ceilings and their deliberate dimensions. Large in the way that geological time makes things large, with a ceiling that curved upward into darkness, well beyond the reach of the lantern, and walls that curved outward in long arcs of pale limestone that had been deposited in layers you could count like the rings of a tree. The floor was level and dry, smoothed by the same long passage of water that had carved the entry tunnel, and the chamber ran back into the hillside for what I estimated in my first stunned count of steps to be at least 80 feet. But I did not count the steps for long before I stopped counting and simply stood, because the chamber was not empty. My grandmother had been here for 30 years, had carried things down that passage and arranged them in this space with the patience and precision of someone who understood that patience and precision were the only tools available to her, and that she would need to use them for a very long time. Along the floor of the chamber, arranged in rows as neat as a kitchen garden, were logs. Oak and poplar cut to uniform lengths of about 4 feet each one, set either upright in the earth of the cave floor or stacked horizontally in configurations I would later learn were called totem stacks, each log touching the next in a deliberate pattern designed to maximize the surface area exposed to the cave's constant humid air. The logs were old. Some of them had been here so long that the bark had separated from the wood beneath and was lifting at the edges like old wallpaper. But they were not dead. Nothing in this room was dead. From the ends of every log, from the gaps between stacked trunks, from the places where bark had cracked and moisture had penetrated, they grew. Mushrooms. Not the small, pale, apologetic mushrooms of field and roadside. Not the buttons that came in tins. These were substantial and alive and various in the way that a forest is various, each species filling its particular niche with the confidence of something that has had years to settle into place. Oyster mushrooms fanned outward from the log ends in overlapping shelves of gray and pearl, and the faintest blue, each shelf larger than my spread hand. Shiitake caps pushed through the bark in neat rows, brown and round-shouldered, with gills so pale they were nearly white. And from the higher log stacks cascading downward in shapes I had only seen in drawings in one of Agnes's books. Lion's mane mushrooms hung in white, shaggy waterfalls, their long spines catching the lantern light and holding it so that they appeared to glow from within. Along the walls, my grandmother had carved shelves directly into the limestone-wide shallow ledges, spaced at intervals of about 18 inches. Each shelf was filled with substrate, a mixture I could smell before I could examine it, deep and complex. The smell of old forest floor, concentrated and refined, of wood chip and straw, and something dark and alive beneath. The substrate was packed into the shelves to a depth of about 6 inches and was populated by its own communities of growth. Different species on different shelves, each one apparently suited to the conditions of its position on the wall. And from the ceiling, suspended on wooden frames that had been bolted into the limestone with an engineering that should not have been possible for one person working alone, hung bags. Dozens of them, large mesh bags, packed tight with substrate, hanging at intervals the length of the chamber, and from each bag grew clusters of mushrooms that cascaded downward in dense, pale, luminous abundance. I walked deeper into the chamber. The lantern shook in my hand, not because my hand was unsteady, but because I was breathing harder than I had realized. And each breath moved my chest, and my chest moved my arm, and my arm moved the lantern, and the light moved across all of that growing, living, impossible abundance in waves. Deeper in the cave, where the passage narrowed slightly before it widened again into a second smaller space, the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way the air changes when you step into a root cellar from a summer afternoon. And in that cooler, wetter air, growing from a substrate that was darker and finer grained than the material in the main chamber, were shapes I recognized from a single illustration in one of the books on Agnes's shelves. Ruffled, golden, growing in clusters that rose from the substrate like small flames caught in the act of burning. Chanterelles. I sat down on the floor of the cave. The cold of the stone came through my dress immediately, but I did not get up. I set the lantern beside me and put my hands in my lap and looked at what my grandmother had built. She had built a cathedral. That is the only word for it. Not because of its size, though it was large. Not because of what grew in it, though that was extraordinary. But because of what it represented, the decades of labor and observation and refinement that had produced this particular arrangement of log and substrate and air and moisture, this understanding of what the cave would give and what it needed in return. This faith in the idea that something worth doing was worth doing for 30 years in the dark alone with no one watching. I thought about the room full of girls in Beckley who had laughed at my inheritance. I thought about Sister Evangeline's careful pause before the words "no commercial value." I thought about Mr. Fenwick's careful neutrality on the drive south, the way he had not tried to prepare me for what I was coming to. Perhaps because he did not know. perhaps because no words would have been adequate preparation anyway. I sat in my grandmother's cathedral and I laughed until I cried, and then I cried until I laughed, and the sound of it went up into the limestone dark above me and came back changed, softened by the stone, and the mushrooms grew on around me in their patient, indifferent abundance. I spent the next 2 weeks reading. Agnes had kept 6 journals, which I found in a trunk under the bed on my second day in the cabin, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cotton cord. They covered the years from 1910, when she had arrived in Keeney's Creek Hollow as a widow of 22, to 1941, the last year she had been well enough to write with any consistency. Each journal was a different size and a different color and had been filled with a different quality of ink depending on what was available in whatever year it covered. But the handwriting was consistent throughout, evolving only in the slow way that handwriting evolves over decades of use, tightening with age, becoming more economical, every word more precisely chosen. She had come to the Hollow from Ashe County in North Carolina, she wrote in the first journal. Her mother's people were from the Cherokee communities along the Oconaluftee Mountain, people who had survived removal by staying hidden in the highest hollows, and her mother had been the keeper of a body of knowledge about plants and soil and fungi that she had passed to Agnes, the way such knowledge has always been passed through use and observation, through the accumulated understanding of generations. Her father had been a white school teacher from Tennessee who had died of typhoid when Agnes was 8, and after that it had been only Agnes and her mother in the mountain and the knowledge the mountain held. She had come to West Virginia because a man she had married died in a mining accident in the first year of their marriage, and because staying in Ashe County after that felt like standing still in a current that was going to take her whether she chose to move or not. She had come to Keeney's Creek because there was land available, and because the limestone geology of the hollow was specific and identifiable on the county map. And she had understood from her mother's teaching that limestone country had properties that most people overlooked. She found the cave in 1913, 3 years after she arrived. She had been following a cold air seep along the base of the cliff one August morning when the air moved against her face with that particular underground steadiness, and she had dug out the entrance with her hands in a single afternoon. She stood in the main chamber for the first time, she wrote, and knew immediately. The temperature was constant. The humidity was near perfect. The air moved, but not violently. The limestone filtered the water that seeped through the walls, leaving it clean and mineral-rich and steady in its flow. It was, she wrote in her precise and unsentimental way, exactly what she had been looking for, though she had not known she was looking for it until she found it. She began with oyster mushrooms because they were forgiving and fast, and because the oak logs that fell in the forest above the hollow were plentiful and already well colonized with wild fungal growth that she could work with rather than against. She learned by failure first, the way all real learning goes, and she recorded her failures with the same care she recorded her successes. This log too wet, this substrate too dense, this position in the chamber too far from the air current. The journal from 1915 to 1920 reads like a detailed account of a scientist learning the grammar of a new language, trial and adjustment, and trial again, each entry adding a new understanding to the accumulating body of knowledge. By 1920, she was producing more mushrooms than she could eat or preserve. She began bringing them to families in the hollow, starting closest to home, the Tatum place 2 miles down the creek, where a woman named Vera had lived alone since her husband died, and who accepted the mushrooms without ceremony and returned the favor in cornmeal and lamp oil, which was the mountain way of saying, I see you, and I will not make a fuss about it. Through those families, she developed the first understanding of what the cave could sustain and what the surrounding community needed. I read through those journals in the evening, sitting at the table with a fire in the stove, and the oil lamp throwing a warm circle of light over the pages, and during the days I went into the cave and tried to understand with my hands what the journals had told me with words. I refreshed logs that had exhausted their production. I mixed new substrate from the materials I found stored in the cabin lean-to, straw and wood chip and aged compost in the proportions Agnes had specified in journal number 3. I repaired shelves that had cracked, tightened the bolts on the ceiling frames that had worked loose. I learned the cave's rhythms, the way the air moved in the early morning and in the late afternoon, the places where moisture collected In the places where it dried too fast, the temperature variations across the chamber that were small but significant. And then I reached the journal from 1931, and everything I thought I understood rearranged itself. Agnes had begun that year to notice something she could not explain within the framework of what she had been taught either by her mother or by the books she had been acquiring and reading for a decade. The mushrooms were behaving in ways that suggested a connectivity she had not accounted for. When she refreshed the logs in the north section of the chamber, the production in the south section increased within days, before any visible connection between the new material and the older logs could have developed. When she added substrate to the wall shelves near the entrance, the ceiling bags at the far end of the chamber showed new growth within a week, despite having no physical contact with the refreshed shelves. She began to watch. She watched the way she had learned to watch everything with patience and precision, and without the interference of a theory she was already committed to. She watched for months. She made notes. She drew diagrams. And then she understood. The mushrooms were not individual organisms. What she could see, the caps and shelves and cascading clusters, those were the fruiting bodies, the visible expression of something much larger and much less visible. Beneath the surface of every log, through every packed substrate bag, across the floor of the cave, and into the cracks of the limestone walls, ran a network of threads so fine they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Mycelium, the true body of the fungus, branching and branching again in a web that ran through the entire chamber, linking every log to every shelf, to every bag, to every crack in the limestone floor, a single vast living system that expressed itself in mushrooms the way a tree expresses itself in leaves. She had not built a farm. She had built a host for a single organism that had spent 20 years threading itself through every available surface in the cave. And that organism was so thoroughly established, so deeply integrated into the limestone, in the wood and the substrate, that it was now effectively impossible to damage or destroy by any ordinary means. She wrote in that 1931 journal, in a passage I have returned to so many times that I know it by heart, the way you know a prayer. The mushrooms are not separate things. They are the fruit of one living web. I have been thinking of this cave as a farm and of myself as a farmer, but those words are wrong. The cave is a body. The mycelium is its blood. What I have been doing is not farming. It is midwifery. I have been helping a living thing become more fully itself. Feed the network and it feeds you. But it is not a transaction. It is a relationship. One that began before I arrived and that will continue after I'm gone. I read that passage sitting on the cave floor with the lantern beside me, and I looked at the ceiling frames with their cascading bags, and at the log rows with their patient caps and shelves, and at the walls with their carved ledges, and I thought about a woman working alone in the dark for 30 years, developing a theory of interconnection that the scientific community would not formally articulate for another 4 decades. She had known. She had known without the language to call it what it was, without the institutional support to verify it, without anyone to tell her that what she was observing was real and significant, and would eventually be recognized as one of the foundational insights of modern ecology. She had known because she had been patient enough and attentive enough and humble enough before the evidence to let the evidence tell her what was true. I closed the journal and sat in the cave and felt for the first time since I had opened that letter in Sister Evangeline's office something that was not anger or grief or bewilderment, something quieter and more durable, something that had a direction to it. The woman appeared at my door on a Monday morning in the second week of April. She was perhaps 68 years old with a face that had been shaped by outdoor weather over many decades into a kind of authority that has nothing to do with position or title. She was carrying a jar of amber honey and wearing an expression of profound and unapologetic assessment. She looked me up and down the way you look at a piece of structural timber you are considering trusting with some weight. "My name is Vera Tatum," she said. "I live 2 miles down the creek. Agnes told me you'd come." I said I had not been aware that anyone knew I was expected. "She knew," Vera said with a simplicity that closed the subject. She handed me the honey jar. "You're skinnier than I thought you'd be." Her voice was flat and direct in the way of a person who had used up all her social patience a long time ago and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. But she came inside without being asked, looked around the cabin with the familiarity of someone who had been there before, noted the changes I had made, which were minor, and sat down at the table. She had known Agnes for more than 20 years. Agnes had brought her mushrooms twice a month for most of that time, walking the 2 miles down the creek and the 2 miles back with a basket over her arm, and in return, Vera had occasionally supplied Agnes with things the hollow did not produce: cornmeal, salt, lamp oil, the kind of quiet, practical exchange that has sustained mountain communities for as long as there have been mountains and communities. She knew about the cave. She had never been inside it. Agnes had not shown it to her, and she had not asked because, in that part of the world, the line between a neighbor's business and your own is drawn early and observed carefully. She knew Agnes grew mushrooms. She knew the cave was where they came from. She knew that Agnes had sealed the entrance years before and had not cleared it again, and she had inferred from the quality of Agnes's silences on the subject that there was a reason for this that she was not going to be told. She had come to see whether I was capable of keeping the place going. She told me with a directness that made the assessment feel more respectful than insulting. Whether I was going to sell the land to the coal company and leave, or stay and be useless, or stay and be something else. I told her I intended to stay. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said all right and finished her coffee and told me she would come back Thursday to show me how to reshingle the east side of the roof before the April rains arrived, and she left. She came back Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and she came on Tuesday mornings through April and May and into the summer, and she brought things: a sack of cornmeal, a dozen eggs, a wool blanket she claimed she didn't need, and she showed me things that Agnes's books had not covered and that could not be learned except from someone who had been doing them for 50 years. How to split shingles from straight-grained oak, how to read the color of the morning sky along the ridge, how to find where the creek was safe to drink and where the runoff from the old surface workings upstream made it unwise, how to know when the last frost was truly past and the ground could be trusted. She was not warm in any conventional sense. She did not offer encouragement or comfort or the kind of gentle reassurance that people who have led difficult lives sometimes seek in the people around them. What she offered was competence and consistency, which are rarer and more valuable, and which I understood because I had been taught to understand them by the same kind of life that had taught her to offer them. I began carrying mushrooms to Whitesville on Saturday mornings in late April. The walk was long, 12 miles round trip, and the reception was cool. Whitesville was a coal town in the late years of what coal towns are. Late years of tired and dusty and cautious about anything that came from outside its established understanding of things. A 16-year-old girl with a basket of cave mushrooms was several steps outside that understanding. People stopped and looked. Some of them asked what was wrong with them. Some asked why they looked like that. A man at the hardware counter told me with the confidence of someone who considers his opinion a public service that cave mushrooms were likely poisonous and that I ought to be ashamed of trying to sell them to honest people. I was not ashamed. I had read 3 different mycological texts on the specific species I was selling, and I could have explained their edibility and their nutritional value and their culinary properties in more detail than anyone in Whitesville wanted to hear. But I had also learned growing up at St. Anne's that the surest way to confirm a skeptic's suspicion is to appear to be trying too hard to change his mind. So I set up my basket and I answered questions when people asked them, and I did not argue when they didn't want to be answered, and I waited. The war was doing what wars do to the places left behind. The men were overseas, meat was rationed, money moved in smaller denominations and with more hesitation. The town had the quality of a place that is managing, but only just, and that has been managing for long enough that the effort of it has started to show around the edges. A woman named Lucille Baird found me on my 3rd Saturday. She was perhaps 40 years old and had 4 children visible behind her, and the look of a woman who had been calculating the same tight arithmetic for so long, it had become her natural expression. Her husband was in the Pacific, she mentioned without drama, the way people mention the weather. She bought a pound of oyster mushrooms for 10 cents. I watched her look at them, turn the bag over in her hands, look at me, look at the mushrooms again. I watched her do the arithmetic of risk and cost and need. She took them home. The following Saturday, she came back with her sister. The Saturday after that, her sister brought 3 neighbors. By the end of May, I had a line. The cave was producing with a generosity that still surprised me, despite everything I had read about what a mature mycelial network was capable of. The organism Agnes had spent 30 years cultivating had reached a depth and complexity of establishment that produced mushrooms the way an old apple tree produces apples abundantly and without requiring much persuasion in response to conditions that it had shaped over decades to suit itself exactly. I harvested 3 times a week. I refreshed logs and substrate on a rotation I had developed from Agnes's journals. I repaired and expanded the shelving. I learned to read the cave the way Agnes had taught herself to read it, by watching, by being consistent, by responding to what I found rather than imposing what I expected. And then in the 3rd week of May, I found the second room. Agnes had mentioned a back chamber in the 5th journal briefly, and in passing describing it as a cooler and drier space she had used for cold weather species that required different conditions than the main cave could offer. She had noted that access was restricted by a partial rockfall that she had found on a day when her back was troubling her and that she had intended to clear when she felt better. The journal then moved on to other matters, and I had not thought much about the passage because there was so much else to think about. But in the 3rd week of May, I was working near the back of the main chamber, clearing an accumulation of spent substrate from the area where the passage narrowed, and my lantern light found the gap in the wall that Agnes had described. It was not a rockfall in any natural sense. The rocks that filled the passage were limestone blocks, rough-edged and heavy, but they had been placed there, not fallen. You could tell by the way they fitted against each other, deliberate rather than random, stacked with the efficiency of someone who intended the obstruction to hold, but also intended it to be removable. It took me 2 full days to move them. I worked in the morning hours when the cave air was freshest and the lantern burned cleanest, carrying each block out and stacking it in the main chamber. Some of them were heavier than anything I should have been moving alone. I moved them anyway in stages, rolling them end over end when I could not lift them, using the rope from the lean-to as a lever when rolling was not possible, sitting on the cave floor between blocks to let my arms recover. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, I moved the last stone and squeezed through into the space beyond. The back chamber was smaller than the main cave, perhaps 20 feet across, roughly circular, with a ceiling that followed the natural curve of the limestone dome above it. The air was noticeably drier and several degrees cooler than the main chamber, the difference subtle but distinct, the kind of difference that matters enormously to seeds. And on every wall on shelves that had been carved into the limestone, with the same patience Agnes had brought to every other element of this place, sat jars. Hundreds of jars, glass of every size and age, mason jars and canning jars, and old medicine bottles and vessels, whose original purpose I could not have named, every one of them, sealed, every one of them, labeled in Agnes's hand. They covered the walls from knee height to as high as Agnes could have reached standing on a step, a continuous curving line of glass catching the lantern light and throwing it back in fragments of amber and gold and pale green. I reached out and took the nearest jar from its shelf. It was a quart mason jar sealed with a rubber ring under a zinc lid, the glass so clean inside that the contents were perfectly visible. Seeds. Small, dark, kidney-shaped seeds, packed loosely enough to show their individual forms. The label read in Agnes's precise lettering, Cherokee Trail of Tears Bean. From my mother, 1894. I stood with that jar in both hands, and I understood. Not in pieces the way understanding usually comes. All at once, the full weight of it arriving together. Agnes had not built one thing inside this mountain. She had built 2. The mushroom cultivation in the main chamber was the harvest. The thing that fed people, the thing that kept the land productive through the long decades of her isolation. But this room was something else entirely. This room was a library. A library written not in words but in seeds, in the living genetic material of 2 centuries of Cherokee and Appalachian farming tradition. In the varieties at the commercial seed companies and the hybrid agriculture extension programs, and the slow homogenization of American food production were systematically eliminating from the landscape. I walked along the shelves and read the labels. Cherokee purple tomato, bloody butcher corn, greasy back bean, candy roaster squash, turkey craw bean, mortgage lifter tomato, fish pepper, lemon drop pepper, rattlesnake pole bean, names that were not names so much as histories, small compressed accounts of the communities that had developed and preserved and passed on these particular plants over generations, each one adapted to specific soils and specific climates and specific culinary traditions that were themselves disappearing along with the seeds. Agnes had written about this in the Sixth Journal. The seed companies want farmers to buy new seeds every year. Hybrid seeds that don't breed true. Seeds that make you dependent on the company rather than on your own land. The Cherokee varieties, the ones my mother gave me, the ones her mother gave her, these are being replaced by commercial strains that yield more but mean less. I am saving what I can. The cave keeps them cool and dry. Seeds can remain viable for decades under the right conditions, and these are the right conditions. Someone must plant them again. Someone must hold them until the world is ready to understand what it is losing. And then, in the corner of the back chamber, on a low shelf near the floor, where I had to crouch to see it, I found the box. It was a small metal container, the kind that tobacco comes in its surface, rusted at the seams, but its lid sealed with a ring of what appeared to be beeswax, applied carefully around the joint to make it airtight. On the lid in a hand I recognized as Agnes's were two words, for Wren. I sat cross-legged on the cave floor with the box in my lap, and I worked the wax seal loose with my thumbnail and opened the lid. Inside was a folded document and a smaller folded paper clip to it. The document was 4 pages of handwritten notes in Agnes's most precise and deliberate hand, organized in columns with dates and names and measurements. The smaller paper was a letter, 2 paragraphs. The letter said, I am leaving you the tools and I am leaving you the weapon. The cave and the seeds are the tools. What is in this box is the weapon. Roy Dunbar's family stole 3 acres of the south-facing slope from me in 1936, using a document that I know to be fraudulent. I had no money for a lawyer and no standing in the county courts. I have spent 2 years collecting what evidence I could, and it is all here. I do not know how or when you will need it. I know only that you will need it, because men like Roy Dunbar do not stop wanting what they have decided belongs to them. Use what is in this box when the time comes. You will know when the time comes. I built the rest for your life. I built this for your survival. She had left me a farm and a library and a lawsuit. I studied those 4 pages for the next week. The document detailed what Agnes had found and how she had found it, specific dates and specific discrepancies, and the logic of her argument was clear and tight, and built with the same care she had brought to her substrate formulas and her mycelial network diagrams. At the center of it was a single factual inconsistency that she had identified and documented and cross-referenced with official records she had obtained somehow from the county clerk's office. The document Roy Dunbar had used to claim the south-facing slope in 1936 bore a date in that year. But the notarial seal pressed into it was a type that Agnes had confirmed through the county clerk was not approved for use in West Virginia until 1938. 2 years wrong. A small error. The kind of error that only someone who was looking for it would find. But Agnes had been looking for it, and she had found it. And she had documented her findings with copies she had obtained of the correct seal type from the county clerk's records. She had left me a case that was already half won. I only had to understand it well enough to finish it. In early June, I planted. The south-facing slope above the cabin was steep, but not unusable. Agnes had begun terracing work on the lower section years before, stacking limestone into low walls to hold soil on the hillside. And though the terraces had grown over in her final years, the structure of them was still there, still sound. I cleared them through May, cutting back the growth and repairing the walls where frost heave had displaced stones. And when the terraces were cleared, I composted spent substrate from the cave mushroom logs that had finished their productive life and the rich dark material from the deep shelves of the back chamber and mixed it into the thin mountain soil. Then I opened Agnes's jars, not all of them. I was not yet confident enough in my understanding of what I was holding to risk a full planting without more knowledge. But I selected 12 varieties, chose my quantities carefully from each jar, and returned the rest to their sealed storage in the back chamber. And I put those seeds into the terraced ground at the intervals and depths Agnes had noted in the sixth journal. The ground took them the way a body takes water after a long thirst. You could almost feel the soil absorbing the seeds, recognizing them the way you recognize something that belongs to you. I learned later that this was the mycelium at work. Agnes's network had been threading itself through the topsoil of the south-facing slope for 15 years by then, since she had begun deliberately seeding the surface ground with spawn from the cave in the late 1920s, a project she had described in the fourth journal as her longest experiment. She had inoculated the slope soil with fungal spawn season after season, working it into the thin mountain dirt, the way you work compost until the mycelium network from the cave had extended its reach through the full 14 acres of her land. The ground I planted those seeds into was not ordinary mountain soil. It was a living system threaded through with 30 years of fungal intelligence, rich with the metabolic products of that network, prepared in ways that no fertilizer could replicate, because no fertilizer was a relationship, and this was a relationship. The seeds germinated in 7 days. In 14 days, the seedlings were thick and dark-leaved and growing with an urgency that made me watch them more than the work required. Cherokee purple tomatoes, greasy back beans on their makeshift trellises of sticks and twine, candy roaster squash spreading their broad leaves across the lowest terrace. They grew fast and they grew strong and they did not stop. It was on a Thursday morning in late June, 3 weeks after I had put the first seeds in the ground, when I heard the truck coming up the hollow road. I heard it before I saw it. The sound of an engine working hard on the grade, the labor of a heavy vehicle on a road that was not meant for heavy vehicles, and then the sound of two vehicles, which was unusual enough in Keeney's Creek, that I straightened up from the terrace wall I was repairing and looked down toward the tree line at the bottom of the hollow. Two trucks came up the road. The first was a late model Ford dark blue recently washed. The second was an older vehicle with the county insignia painted on its door. Roy Dunbar got out of the first truck. I had seen him only once before that first week when he had come to the cabin and offered to buy the land in a voice so smooth and quiet it had taken me a moment to understand that what it contained was not friendliness. He was perhaps 50 years old, a compact man with the kind of face that has been arranging itself into expressions of reasonable authority for so long that the authority and the arrangement have become the same thing. He was wearing work clothes, clean ones, and he carried a folder of papers under his arm. The man who got out of the county vehicle was the county sheriff, or someone dressed as one. He had the careful walk of a man who has been placed in a situation he did not entirely choose and is managing his discomfort with professional neutrality. Roy Dunbar came up the path without being invited. He looked at the terraces. He looked at the cabin. He looked at me. He smiled, which was the most alarming thing he did. He opened the folder. He showed me a document that he described as a deed of conveyance properly recorded with the county clerk transferring the south-facing slope of the Callaway property, 3 acres of it, to Dunbar Ridge Coal Company, signed in 1936. The land you are farming, he said with a pleasantness that was a specific kind of threat, is not your land. The hollow where your cabin sits, that is your land, the old lady's land. And I've got no quarrel with that. But this slope, these terraces, everything above the creek line on the southern exposure that belongs to us, has belonged to us for 6 years. Your grandmother chose not to make an issue of it, which was sensible of her. I'm here hoping you'll make the same sensible choice. He gave me 30 days to clear the terraces of whatever I had planted. Then he said the other thing. He said it the way you say the thing you came to say, the thing the rest of it was only a preparation for. He said that if I chose to contest the deed of conveyance, he would be obligated to raise a separate matter with the county court, namely whether a 16-year-old girl with no guardian and no legal standing was properly entitled to inherit property in the state of West Virginia, and whether the estate of Agnes Calloway had been properly administered, and whether the whole question of ownership might not need to be reviewed more thoroughly. He picked up his folder. He looked at the terraces one more time. "You don't have a lawyer," he said. "You don't have anyone in this county who knows your name. You've got nothing but an old dead woman's word that any of this belongs to you. Think carefully." He walked back down to his truck. The sheriff walked beside him without having spoken a single word. The trucks went back down the road and the sound of their engines faded, and the hollow went quiet again. I stood on the terrace and looked at the seedlings. Cherokee purple, 3 weeks in the ground, their small furrowed leaves reaching for the June light. Greasy back beans climbing their stick trellises. Candy roasters spreading slow and certain across the lowest stones. I went into the cabin. I went to the corner where I had put the metal box from the back chamber. I took it out and opened it and laid the 4 pages of Agnes's documentation on the table and sat down and began to read them again more carefully this time, with the attention of someone who is trying to understand not just what something says, but what it can do. I was not afraid. That surprised me. I had been afraid of many things in my life. The quiet institutional fear of a child who understands that her circumstances can always get worse and that they frequently will. But sitting at that table in the cabin with Agnes's papers in front of me and Roy Dunbar's 30-day deadline settling into the air around me like weather, I was not afraid. I was something else, something more focused and more cold. The same feeling I had felt on the 3rd day of clearing vines when the air from the cave hit my face and I understood what I had found and I cut faster. That night I put Agnes's papers back in the box and set the box on the shelf above the stove and made myself a meal from the mushrooms I had harvested that morning, cooked over the wood fire with the last of the wild ramps from the creek bank, and I ate and I thought, and I did not sleep until very late. 4 days later, I woke before dawn to a smell. It reached me through the cabin wall before I was fully awake, working itself into my sleep, and pulling me up through it, the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, the warm domestic smell of a stove fire or a campfire. This was the flat, bitter smell of green material burning vegetation that was not meant to burn being forced to burn. I was dressed and out the door before I was fully thinking. The sky to the south was orange at the base above the ridgeline, the color that belongs to a fire that has been burning long enough to produce its own light. I ran up the path to the terraces. The lower terrace was gone. The seedlings I had put in the ground 3 weeks ago, the Cherokee purple tomatoes and the greasy back beans and the first careful investments of Agnes's seed bank and living soil, they were ash. The fire had moved up from the bottom from the creek side, deliberately set and deliberately pointed uphill, and it had taken everything on the lower 2 terraces before the dew-wet upper stonework had stopped it. I stood at the edge of the burned section and looked at it in the growing light. The ash was still warm. The stones of the terrace walls were fire-blackened on their lower faces. The stick trellises I had built for the beans were gone, entirely reduced to lines of gray powder on the scorched ground. I stood there for a long time. The sky got lighter. Birds began in the trees above the ridge. Then I crouched down. I put my hands flat on the burned ground, fingers spread the way you lay your hands on something to feel what it holds. The surface was hot ash and cold earth underneath, and the smell of it came up through my palms and into my arms. Loss and ruin and the desolation of destroyed work. But beneath my palms in the soil, I felt something. I had been in the cave long enough by then. I had read enough. I had watched the mycelial network closely enough in its daily expressions of growth and connection to know, without being able to articulate it yet, with any scientific precision, the quality of soil that it inhabited. And the soil under my burned palms had that quality. The mycelium was there. Below the heat of the fire, below the scorched surface, the network Agnes had threaded through this slope over 15 years was intact. Fire travels on surfaces. It does not go deep. Whatever had been destroyed above was not what Agnes had spent 15 years building below. I stayed crouched with my hands on the ground for a long time. The mycelium was still there. Below the fire, below the ruin, below everything Dunbar had managed to destroy, the network Agnes had built over 15 years was intact and alive and waiting. I stood up. There was work to do. The sun cleared the eastern ridge before I moved from that terrace. When I finally walked the full perimeter of the slope from the creek line at the bottom to the limestone outcropping at the top, my hands trailing along the stone walls Agnes had built, I read the damage the way you read something written in a language you are still learning. The fire had taken the lower two terraces completely. The third and fourth terraces, where the stones were higher and the ground had held more moisture from the spring rains, had been scorched at their edges but not destroyed. 3 seed varieties were gone. 9 remained in the ground, shaken, but rooted, their stems blackened at the base but alive above the burn line. The candy roaster squash on the uppermost terrace had not been touched at all. Its broad leaves were gray with ash, fall but intact, and when I pressed my thumb against the nearest stem, I felt the firm resistance of living tissue. I noted all of this without sentiment. I was not doing it to feel better. I was doing it because Agnes had spent 30 years doing it, because the accurate assessment of what remains after loss is the only foundation on which anything useful can be built. And because I had learned from her journals and from the years before her journals that the alternative to accurate assessment is the kind of grief that goes nowhere and produces nothing. Then I went to the cabin and I sat at the table and I opened the metal box. I had read Agnes's 4 pages of documentation several times already. I had read them the way you read something when you are gathering information efficiently and with the goal of understanding the whole picture. Now I read them differently. I read them the way you read something when you are preparing to use it slowly and with attention to every word, looking for the joints between the pieces. The places where one argument connected to the next. The places where the evidence Agnes had gathered would need to be explained clearly to someone who had not spent 2 years assembling it. The core of it was not complicated. Agnes had stated it plainly in her notes, and plainly was how I read it now. Roy Dunbar's family had filed a deed of conveyance with the county clerk in 1936, claiming 3 acres of the south-facing slope. The deed bore a notarial seal. Agnes had compared that seal with the official seal type on file at the county clerk's office and had found that they did not match. The seal pressed into Dunbar's document was a design that had been adopted by the West Virginia Secretary of State's office as the standard notarial form in 1938. The document, claiming to have been notarized in 1936, bore a seal that did not exist in 1936. Agnes had documented this comparison with the methodical care of a woman who understood that documentation is the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it. She had obtained through the county clerk's office a certified copy of the official seal specification and change notice from 1938. She had traced both seals onto separate pieces of paper and noted the differences in a numbered list. She had attached signed statements from 2 neighbors who had been present at the original property boundary survey in 1929 and could testify to where the boundary lines had been drawn. She had also, with a thoroughness that I found both stunning and completely characteristic of everything I had come to understand about her, included a copy of the county recording statute that governed the requirements for valid deed registration in West Virginia, with the relevant passages underlined in the careful ink of a woman who had taught herself law, the same way she had taught herself mycology from books alone at night by the light of a lamp she had filled herself. She had built me a case. She had built it over 2 years and sealed it in beeswax and left it in the darkest corner of a cave for me to find. I spent 3 weeks preparing. The Whitesville Public Library was 12 miles round trip on foot, and I made the walk 4 times in those 3 weeks, each time carrying Agnes's papers in a canvas bag and spending the hours the library was open, working through the legal texts on the single shelf the library devoted to such things. They were outdated in some respects and incomplete in others, but they gave me the vocabulary I needed and the procedural framework, and they confirmed what Agnes's notes had suggested, that a fraudulent notarial seal on a recorded deed was not a technicality. It was grounds for the deed to be voided. It was, in the language of one of the texts, a fundamental defect in the instrument of conveyance. I did not know how to argue a case before a judge. I did not know the proper form for filing a motion or the correct way to address a court, or the procedural sequence of a property dispute in Mingo County. What I knew was how to read carefully and how to organize what I had read and how to present an argument in writing with enough clarity that the logic of it was visible to anyone who followed it without prejudice. I wrote my response to Dunbar's claim by hand at the table in the cabin in the evenings after the cave work was done. I wrote 3 drafts before I had one I thought was clear enough to submit. I described the property as Agnes had recorded it in the original 1910 deed. I described the Dunbar deed of conveyance and its stated date. I described the notarial seal and its discrepancy with the official seal type in use at that time. I attached Agnes's documentation as exhibits, numbered and referenced the way the legal text had shown me exhibits should be attached. I wrote a conclusion that stated what I was asking the court to do, which was to examine the exhibits, verify the discrepancy I had described, and declare the Dunbar deed void on grounds of fraudulent notarization. I did not use legal language I did not understand. I used plain language that said what I meant, and I organized it so that the sequence of the argument was impossible to miss. Agnes's notes were precise. The evidence she had gathered was specific. My job was not to make it more complicated. My job was to make it more visible. I filed the response with the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning in late July, paid the filing fee with money I had saved from mushroom sales, and walked the 12 miles home. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in early August that Cormac Pruitt first came up the hollow road. I heard him before I saw him the way you hear most things in that hollow, before they appear, the sound traveling ahead around the bends in the road and arriving modified by the trees and the creek noise and the acoustics of the narrow valley. Footsteps on the dirt road rather than a vehicle, which was unusual enough that I straightened up from the cave entrance where I had been working and looked down toward the path. He was perhaps 22 years old, tall in the way that men from mining families are sometimes tall, as if growing up in low-ceiling spaces had made the body more determined rather than less. He had the kind of face that outdoor work and military service make, and young men spare and watchful, the soft parts worn away by weather and experience leaving something plainer and more durable. He was carrying a canvas pack over one shoulder and wearing the jacket of a man who has recently been somewhere cold and has not yet entirely adjusted to not being there. He had heard about the hollow from a county extension agent in Williamson. He told me standing at the bottom of the path with a courtesy that had nothing tentative about it. He had heard there was a girl growing things up in Keeney's Creek that nobody else had been able to grow varieties that the Extension Service didn't have records for. And he was interested in seeing them because he had spent the last 8 months at an agricultural college in Morgantown on the GI Bill, and he was trying to understand what was being lost from the mountain seed stock before it was gone entirely. I looked at him for a moment, then I said he could come up. He walked through the terraces without saying much, which was the right response. He crouched down at the third terrace where the surviving greasy back beans had put out new growth since the fire, their leaves reaching up through the ash-mixed soil with an insistence that I had found each morning quietly extraordinary. He looked at the burn marks on the lower stonework and did not ask about them. He touched the bean leaves with a careful light hand, the kind of touch that belongs to someone who has been taught that plants are information and that information is fragile. I took him into the cave. He stood in the main chamber the way everyone stands there the first time, with the stillness of a person whose category system has been interrupted and who is waiting for a new one to form. He looked at the log rows. He looked at the ceiling bags. He looked at the carved shelves on the walls. He was quiet for a long time. He said eventually, "How long has this been here?" I said 30 years. He nodded slowly, not in surprise exactly, but in the way you nod when something you suspected turns out to be true. I took him to the back chamber. I stood in the entrance and held up the lantern and let him see the walls of jars. 214 of them at that count, each one sealed, each one labeled, each one representing a variety that commercial agriculture had decided was not worth keeping and that my grandmother had decided was not worth losing. He stood there for a long time, longer than he had stood in the main chamber. I watched his face in the lantern light and saw a sequence of expressions that the seed vault produced in people who were capable of understanding what they were looking at. Surprise first, which was ordinary. Then something slower and more serious, a recalibration, a reassessment of the scale of what had been done here and the length of time it had taken to do it. And then in people who truly understood, a kind of grief that had nothing mournful about it, the grief of recognizing something precious that had been in danger of being lost. He said very quietly, "Does anyone know this is here? I said a county botanist was coming next month." He nodded. He stayed in the entrance to the chamber for another moment, looking at the jars. Then he turned around and we walked back through the main cave to the entrance, and in the late afternoon light of the hollow, he looked at the burned terraces again and then at me, and this time he did ask. I told him about Dunbar, about the deed, about the filing, about the 30 days that had become 37, and that I was waiting to hear from the county court. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and which I noticed. When I finished, he said nothing about the legal situation, which I respected, because he understood correctly that there was nothing useful he could add to it. Instead, he said, "What do you need planted before September?" He stayed 4 days that first visit. He helped me clear the burned terrace and work fresh substrate and compost into the soil and replant from the reserve of seeds I had kept back from the cave. Not all of them, never all of them at once, but enough to restore the lower terraces before the growing season ended. He worked with the efficiency of someone who has learned that work done well is its own kind of conversation. And when we did talk, in the evenings at the cabin table over food that I had cooked from the cave mushrooms and the surviving garden, he asked about Agnes. Not about the property or the legal situation or the practical questions that everyone else had asked. About Agnes herself. What was she like, he asked. I told him I didn't know. I told him I had never met her, and that everything I knew about her came from 6 journals and a shelf of books and a letter in an envelope and the evidence of her work. I told him that from those things I had formed an impression of a woman who was precise and patient, and who had loved the world she lived in with a devotion so complete that she had spent 30 years building something in the dark so that it could outlast her. He listened to this without filling the silence when I finished, which was also rare, and which I also noticed. He went back to Morgantown and came back 6 weeks later, and the time after that he did not go back. Dr. Marion Stokes arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, 3 days after I received the notice from the county court that a hearing had been scheduled for the last week of October. She had been driving for 3 hours from Marshall University in Huntington, and she arrived in a car that was loaded with books and specimen boxes and the disorder of a person who has spent decades prioritizing intellectual work over personal organization. She was perhaps 45 years old, with gray at her temples, and the kind of focus in her eyes that belongs to people who are always seeing something other people have missed. She had heard about the hollow from the County Agricultural Extension Service, which had heard about it from the school in Whitesville, which had heard about it from a teacher who had bought mushrooms from me on several consecutive Saturdays, and had mentioned to someone that the girl growing them also appeared to have a collection of seed varieties that were not in any catalog he was aware of. The information had traveled through several people before it reached Dr. Stokes, which told me something about how certain things have a way of finding the people who need to find them. I took her directly to the back chamber. She walked in ahead of me, and I held the lantern up from the entrance, and I watched her stop. She did not make a sound for a long time. She walked along the first shelf with her hands behind her back, reading the labels without touching the jars, the way you move through a museum when you are trying to see everything before you let yourself stop at any one thing. She moved slowly, and I could see from the way her lips moved slightly that she was reading each label aloud to herself, quietly, privately, the way you read something when you need to hear it to believe it. Then she stopped. She reached out and lifted a jar from the third shelf and held it in both hands at the level of her face and turned it slowly in the lantern light. The seeds inside shifted with the motion, a small dry sound in the sealed glass. The label read Bloody Butcher Corn, A. Callaway from Regional Stock 1902. She said in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet, "The last confirmed planting of this variety was recorded in Campbell County in 1918. The seed bank at the university has been searching for a viable specimen for 11 years. She put the jar down carefully with the precision of someone managing their own hands. Then she turned around and I saw what I had not expected to see on the face of a scientist, which was tears. Not the quiet overflow of someone caught off guard, but the deliberate tears of a person who has understood something important and is not going to pretend that understanding does not move her. She did not apologize for them, and I did not remark on them, both of which seemed correct. She spent 4 hours in the back chamber that day, moving slowly along the walls, reading every label, writing in her notebook, with a focused intensity that required nothing from me, and to which I offered nothing, understanding that the best thing I could do for what was happening in that room was to stay out of its way. She counted 214 distinct varieties. She identified by label alone 37 that she described as critically rare, meaning that no viable specimen was known to exist in any institutional seed bank in the country. She identified a further 61 that were absent from university collections, but for which other private specimens might exist. And she found 12 that she said she had not known existed at all, varieties so far outside the commercial breeding record that they represented lines of development she had no way to trace without further research. She stayed for dinner. She sat at the cabin table and ate mushrooms cooked with the last of the summer herbs, and she told me what she knew about the history of seed diversity loss in Appalachia, which was a great deal and which mapped exactly onto what Agnes had written in the sixth journal. The same understanding reached by different paths by two women who had never met. Before she left, she wrote a letter. She sat at Agnes's table with Agnes's pen and wrote 2 pages on her university letterhead addressed to the Mingo County Court of Common Pleas, attesting to the nature and significance of the seed collection in the Callaway Properties limestone cave, and to the irreplaceable historical and biological value of the land that contained it. She left the letter with me and said she would make herself available to appear in person if the court required it. I thanked her. She waved the thanks away with the impatience of a person who considers thanks a distraction from the work. The hearing was on a Wednesday morning in the last week of October in a courtroom in the county courthouse in Williamson that smelled of old wood in the staleness of rooms where the same arguments have been made for 100 years. I had walked to the bus stop in Whitesville the evening before and ridden the bus through the dark mountains to Williamson and slept in the bus station, which was not comfortable but was warm enough. I wore my better dress. I carried Agnes's papers in the canvas bag organized in the sequence I had rehearsed until I could move through it without thinking. I had Dr. Stokes's letter in a separate envelope, clean and unfolded. I had the certified copy of the 1938 seal change notice from the county clerk's office. I had the traced copies of both seals side by side on a single sheet, the differences labeled with a numbered key. Roy Dunbar was already in the courtroom when I arrived. He had a lawyer with him, a man in a proper suit who carried his briefcase with the confidence of someone who has spent years in these rooms and who considers their outcomes more or less predictable. Dunbar himself sat with his hands folded on the table and did not look at me when I came in, which I took to mean that he had decided I was not worth the effort of looking at, and which I decided to find useful rather than insulting. The judge was a man of about 60, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that moved over everything in the room with the practiced assessment of someone who has learned to read the difference between what people present and what they have. Dunbar's lawyer went up first. He presented the deed of conveyance, described its recording with the county clerk, cited the relevant sections of state property law governing rightful conveyance, and concluded that the matter was straightforward. A properly recorded deed, he said, was a properly recorded deed, and the claim of a minor with no legal counsel and no established standing in the county property record did not constitute grounds for its review. The judge looked at me. He said I could respond. I stood up. I did not have notes in front of me because I had read what I had written often enough that I did not need them. I spoke to the judge and not to the room because the room was not the point. I told him that the deed of conveyance Roy Dunbar had filed in 1936 was fraudulent, and I told him exactly why it was fraudulent in plain language that did not require legal training to follow. I told him about the notarial seal, about the discrepancy about the 1938 change notice. I placed the exhibits on the clerk's desk in their numbered sequence. I placed Dr. Stokes's letter beside them. Then I did one more thing. I reached into the canvas bag and I brought out 3 jars from the seed vault. Cherokee Trail of Tears, bean labeled in Agnes's hand from my mother, 1894. Bloody Butcher Corn, 1902. Greasy Back Bean, 1911. I set them on the clerk's desk beside the legal papers, and I let the judge look at them for a moment before I spoke again. I said the land Roy Dunbar is claiming to own contains a seed vault that a scientist from Marshall University has identified as the most significant private collection of rare and indigenous plant varieties in the eastern United States. It contains varieties that are otherwise extinct. It contains the life's work of a woman who spent 30 years building something that she understood was irreplaceable, because she understood what was being lost, and she decided that she was going to save what she could. Roy Dunbar did not file a fraudulent deed because he wanted 3 acres of steep hillside. He filed it because the land those 3 acres sit on is not worthless. It never was. He just understood that before I did. I said I don't have a lawyer. I don't have money or standing or anyone in this county who owes me a favor. I have what my grandmother left me, which is this documentation and this evidence and these jars. She prepared the case. I am only presenting it. She believed it was enough to win. I believe she was right. I sat down. The judge looked at the exhibits for a long time. He looked at the seal copies, the 2 tracings side by side, on the single sheet, the differences numbered and labeled. He looked at the 1938 change notice. He looked at the jars. Dunbar's lawyer said something about minor procedural inconsistencies not being grounds for voiding a recorded deed. The judge listened to this with an expression that suggested he had heard the argument before and had already decided how he felt about it. He ruled from the bench. He examined the seal comparison and the change notice and found the discrepancy Agnes had identified to be valid and material. He found the deed of conveyance filed by Dunbar Ridge Coal Company in 1936 to be fraudulent in its notarization and therefore void from the date of its filing. He ordered the county recording to be corrected to reflect the original 1910 Callaway property boundaries. He noted for the record that the matter was being referred to the State Attorney General's office for review of the original fraudulent filing. Roy Dunbar left the courtroom without looking at me. His lawyer followed at 2 paces, carrying his briefcase with slightly less confidence than he had entered with. I sat at the table for a moment after they were gone. The room was quiet. The judge had retired. The clerk was arranging papers on his desk with the focused indifference of a man for whom courtroom outcomes are administrative rather than personal events. I gathered Agnes's papers and put them back in the canvas bag. I put the 3 seed jars in carefully one by one. I picked up my bag and walked out of the courthouse into the October air, which was cold and sharp and smelled of the mountains. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it. I had no one to tell. Cormac was in Keeney's Creek. Vera Tatum had refused to come to Williamson on principle, having formed opinions about county courthouses decades ago that she saw no reason to revise. Dr. Stokes was in Huntington. There was no one on the courthouse steps who knew my name or cared about the outcome of what had just happened in that room. That was all right. Some things are meant to be known alone first before they become part of the larger story. Agnes had known 30 years of work alone in a cave with no audience and no affirmation, and she had not stopped. I could know one morning's victory alone on a courthouse step in October. I took the bus home and walked up the hollow road in the late afternoon and told Cormac, who was in the garden replanting the lowest terrace with the winter cover crop we had decided on together. He straightened up when he saw my face, and I told him. And he nodded once, the slow nod of a man who had believed it would come out right, but had not allowed himself to say so until it did. Then he went back to planting, which was exactly right. The following spring, I planted the full terrace system for the first time. Not the 12 varieties I had started with. Not a cautious sampling, the full range of what Agnes had saved methodically, terrace by terrace, variety by variety. Consulting the 6th journal for Agnes's notes on the specific conditions each plant required, and the specific diseases each was susceptible to, and the specific indicators that told you whether the soil was ready or whether you needed to wait another week. The candy roaster squash went on the lowest terrace where the soil was deepest and the water table was closest. The corn went on the exposed upper terraces where the sun was longest and the air movement was best. The beans climbed their stick trellises on the middle terraces, and the tomatoes went against the south-facing stone walls where the limestone held the day's warmth through the night. Everything grew. It grew the way things grow in soil that has been prepared by decades of patient cultivation with an abundance that was not casual or accidental, but earned the result of a relationship between land and keeper that had been building since before I was born. Cherokee purple tomatoes, the color of old bruises so sweet they made you close your eyes. Greasy back beans climbing 10 feet and producing pods until the first hard frost. Candy roaster squash swelling to weights that required two hands to carry and storing through the full winter in the root cellar without losing their sweetness. People came from Whitesville. They came from further. They came the way people have always come, to places where food grows that is better than the food they have known, following word of mouth through the network of knowledge that moves through communities too poor to waste information. I sold what I could spare and gave away what I could not sell and traded for things the hollow did not produce. And by the end of that first full season, I had a list of customers that reached from Keeney's Creek to the edge of the county, and I had letters from 3 families in neighboring hollows asking whether I could teach them what I was doing. I did. Dr. Stokes came back in the fall of 1944 and spent 2 weeks at the cabin helping me catalog the seed collection formally. We worked through the back chamber, systematically recording each variety in a ledger she had brought from the university, noting the label information and the apparent condition of each sample, and the known provenance where Agnes had recorded it. We found 231 distinct varieties in total. We found 6 for which Agnes had recorded no provenance at all, only a symbol I did not recognize, which Dr. Stokes thought might be a Cherokee notation for medicine plant, which would mean they were varieties with uses that went beyond food. She connected me that winter with the university's Department of Agricultural Science, and through them with the State Extension Service, and through them with a small network of people across the region who had been doing quietly what Agnes had done, saving what was being lost, holding in private collections, what was disappearing from commercial agriculture. They were farmers and gardeners and old women who had been keeping certain seeds in tin cans on back shelves for decades because something in them could not bear to let those things go. When they heard about the cave and the collection Agnes had built, the response was not surprise. It was recognition. The recognition of people who have been doing something alone and have just discovered they were not alone. Cormac and I were married in the Hollow in the fall of 1947. Vera Tatum came wearing a dress that suggested she had made some effort with the occasion while maintaining plausible deniability about having done so. She did not hug me. She brought wildflowers she had picked herself, the kind that grew along the creek in late September, and she arranged them in a jar on the cabin table without comment, which was the most graceful thing I had ever seen her do. She died in the spring of 1953. She had been sick through the winter, the lungs the same thing that had taken Agnes, the thing that takes a great many people in mountain country, where the air has been carrying coal dust for 100 years. She died on a bright morning in April, which seemed wrong, and also somehow exactly right because Vera Tatum would not have approved of dying on a gloomy day. I buried her on the hill above the cabin, where the ridge curved back to give a long view down the hollow to where the creek bent south and disappeared into the trees. I planted Cherokee purple tomatoes on her grave in the spring because she had told me once, without any sentiment at all, that they were the best things she had ever put in her mouth and that she intended to feel that way forever. The Agnes Callaway Heritage Seed Bank, as Dr. Stokes formally named it in the papers she published in 1948 and 1951, grew through the years as Agnes's original collection expanded through what Cormac and I added from the living garden each season, and through what the network of seed savers we had connected with contributed from their own holdings. By 1955, the collection held 340 varieties. By 1965, when our youngest child was old enough to begin learning the cave systems alongside us, it held 480. The Department of Agriculture sent a researcher in 1968. He spent 3 days in the back chamber and wrote a report that described the collection as the most comprehensive surviving repository of pre-commercial Appalachian and Cherokee agricultural heritage in the eastern United States. The report recommended formal recognition and preservation support. The recognition came the following year. The support was slower, as support from formal institutions always is, but it came too. People arrived from everywhere in those years. Farmers and scientists and students and journalists, and just people, ordinary people who had heard about the cave, from someone who had heard about it from someone else, and who had come because the idea of it, a woman working alone in a mountain for 30 years to save something the world was losing, had reached them in whatever way such ideas reach people through a newspaper, or a conversation, or a dream, and they had needed to see it. I took them all into the cave. I took them through the main chamber first, let them see the mushroom operation, the log rows and the ceiling bags, and the carved shelves, let them understand the scale of what Agnes had built, and how long it had taken, and how a single organism had threaded itself through the limestone over 30 years to produce the abundance they were looking at. Then I took them to the back chamber, and I stood in the entrance with the lantern, and I let them see the jars. Every one of them went quiet. I never had to tell them to. The room produced its own silence, the particular silence of being in the presence of something that you cannot quite fit into the categories you arrived with. It was the silence of scale reconsidered of time, understood differently of a single person's patience, suddenly visible in its full dimension. One evening in the winter of 1971, I was in the back chamber alone, doing the seasonal check of the collection that I did twice a year, working along the shelves with a lantern and the ledger noting the condition of each jar, looking for signs of moisture or temperature fluctuation that might threaten the seeds. I had been doing this for nearly 30 years by then, and I knew the room the way, any space you have spent thousands of hours in with my body as much as with my eyes. The sound of each footstep on the stone floor, the way the lantern light fell differently in the corner by the east wall. I was working my way along the lowest shelf, the one that ran at knee height along the back wall, when I noticed something I had not noticed in 30 years of working in that room. The limestone of the back wall just above the level of the lowest shelf was not entirely uniform. There was a section perhaps 2 feet wide where the surface texture was slightly different from the surrounding rock, smoother, as if it had been worked rather than left as the water had formed it. And in the center of that section, pressed into a shallow crack that I had always assumed was a natural fissure in the limestone, was something dark and cylindrical. I set the lantern on the floor and crouched down and looked at it directly for the first time, which told me that I had been looking past it for years, the way you look past things that are always in the same place. It was sealed with wax, the same beeswax Agnes had used on the metal box, pressed into the cracks around whatever was inside with the same careful, thorough application, the same understanding that what was being preserved needed to be protected from the air and from the slow passage of decades. I worked the wax loose with my thumbnail the way I had worked the lid of the metal box, and what came out of the crack was a small book bound in cloth the size of a shirt pocket, wrapped in a layer of oilskin that crinkled when I unfolded it. The cloth of the binding was dark with age, and the oilskin had compressed around it until they were almost one material. Inside in pencil that had faded to a pale gray that was still perfectly legible in the lantern light was Agnes's handwriting. Not the careful ink hand of the journals on the shelf, smaller, more compressed. The hand of a person writing in private in a small book in a place where they were unlikely to be observed with no expectation of an audience. It was dated entries the way a diary is dated, running from October 1939 through December of that year. 3 months. The fall she had gone to Beckley. I read it on the floor of the back chamber, sitting cross-legged with the lantern beside me, the cold of the stone coming up through the wool of my skirt, and the cold of the cave air pressing against my back and shoulders. I read each entry twice. Some of them I read 3 times. She had taken the bus to Beckley on a Tuesday in October. She had arrived in the late morning and walked from the bus station to St. Anne's, which was further than she had expected a walk that had cost her more than she admitted in the writing, though you could read the cost between the lines in the sparseness of her description of the return walk to the station. She had stood outside the iron fence. She had waited. The entry for that day was longer than any of the others, written in a hand that was pressed harder into the paper than usual, as if the pressure of the pen could substitute for the pressure of other things she was not saying. She described the grounds of St. Anne's, the iron fence, the trees inside it, the building's gray face. She described the time passing, the way the light changed on the grounds through the afternoon. And then she described me coming out. She wrote, a girl came out at 3 o'clock through the side door and walked to a bench under the sycamore tree near the front fence. She was small and moved with the economy of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible, which is something you learn in institutions, and which I recognize because I have spent a life trying to unlearn it. She sat down and opened a notebook and began to draw. She tilted her head to look at what she was drawing and then looked back down. She did not look around her to see if she was being watched, which is something children in institutions usually do, and which told me she had found a way to be entirely inside the work she was doing, which is rarer in children than people understand, and which I consider a form of grace. She wrote, I started toward the gate twice. I stopped both times. I stood at the fence and I watched her draw, and I thought about what I could give her. A grandmother who was already dying. One, perhaps 2 more years of someone to belong to, followed by another loss in a life that had already had more losses than a child should have to carry. Or I could give her 30 years of work. I could give her a cave full of living things that would outlast me by generations. I could give her a lawsuit already half won and a collection of seeds that would matter to people she had not yet met, and a network of mycelium that would hold the hillside together long after I was gone. She wrote, I could not give her both. I am not large enough to give her both. So I gave her the thing I had spent my life building, and I kept to myself the thing I had spent my life being. And I pray that the first is large enough to substitute for the second, because it is all I have. She wrote, she did not look up when I left. She was still drawing. Her pencil moved with the quick confidence of someone who has drawn the same kinds of things many times and does not need to think about the basic forms anymore, only the specific instance in front of her. I watched her for another moment from further down the road. She wrote, she is exactly who I needed her to be. I do not say that to comfort myself. I say it because it is true in the specific way that true things are true without requiring my preference. She is precise and patient, and she does not need to be observed to do the work. She will find the cave. She will read the journals. She will find the box. She is the right person. Not because she is my granddaughter, though she is, but because she is herself, and herself is exactly what the cave needs. She wrote on the last page in a hand that was slightly different from the rest, written perhaps at a different time, perhaps on the bus home or in the cabin by lamplight, I want her to know this, not as comfort and not as explanation, as the simple truth which she deserves because she has been living in institutions that have not always given her simple truths. The truth is, I saw her. I chose her, not because I had no other option, because she was the right one. She is loved in the only way I know how to love, which is to build something and leave it, and trust that the person it is built for will be equal to it. I believe she will be. I believe it the way I believe in mycelium, which is to say, I believe it because I have watched the evidence long enough to know it is true. I sat on the stone floor of the cave for a long time after I finished reading. The lantern burned beside me. The back chamber was cold and quiet. The jars on the walls caught the light and held it 600 of them by then, a whole curved horizon of glass and seed, and the patient labor of decades breathing in the cool dark the way the cave itself breathed. I had carried for 30 years the weight that comes from being left, not abandoned in the sharp way, not thrown away. Left in the complicated way by someone who believed they were making the right choice, which is in some ways a harder thing to carry because it does not permit the clarity of simple anger. I had carried it without putting it down the way you carry things you have never found the right place to set. I put it down, there in the cave on the floor in the cold with the lantern burning beside me and the jars breathing around me. I put it down, not because the letter made the leaving right, Not because explanation is the same as redemption, but because I understood finally and understanding is its own kind of release. Agnes had stood outside a fence in October and watched me draw, and gone home and spent 3 more years finishing what she had started. For me, knowing she would not be there to see what I did with it, trusting me with something she had spent 30 years building on the strength of one afternoon of watching a girl tilt her head to get the proportions right. That is a particular form of love. Not the warm kind, not the kind that comes easily or asks to be thanked. The kind that says, I see what you are capable of, and I am going to spend everything I have making sure you have the room to be capable of it, and I will not be there when you arrive. And I need you to understand that this was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. I understood. And some weights, when you finally understand what they are made of, stop feeling like burdens. They feel like foundations, and you build on them. Cormac died in the autumn of 1979 on a September afternoon that was the kind of clear and warm that September afternoons in the mountains sometimes produce, as if the season is offering one final abundance before it closes. He had been sitting on the porch after lunch with a cup of coffee and the sound of the creek below, and when I came out to sit with him, he was already somewhere I could not follow peacefully and without pain, the way a life that has been lived honestly sometimes ends. I buried him on the hill beside Vera, where the ridge gave the long view down the hollow. I kept working. Our children took over the business operations, the mushroom supply contracts, the seed distribution program, the educational workshops we had been running for young farmers across the region since the early 1960s. But I tended the cave myself every morning until I could not. I checked the temperature and the humidity. I talked to the mycelium the way Agnes had talked to it, not because I believed it could hear me, but because 30 years of working alone in a space teaches you to use your voice as an orientation, a way of remaining present, of staying connected to the work and to the living thing the work was in service of. I mixed substrate and refreshed logs and checked the sealing bags and walked the length of the main chamber and stood at the entrance to the back chamber and looked at the jars. 640 varieties by the end, seeds from communities and families and old women's back shelves from across the mountains, collected over 4 decades, added to what Agnes had saved, building outward from the original core, the way a mycelial network builds one connection at a time, patient and persistent and oriented toward life. In the spring of 1986, on a morning in late March, when the first green was coming into the hollow and the creek was running high with snowmelt, I walked down the path to the cave entrance, for what I did not know would be the last time, though. Some part of me may have known because I brought with me the first jar I had ever opened in the back chamber, the one I had held in the lamplight on that first afternoon of discovery, the one Agnes had labeled in the hand of a woman whose hands had not yet begun to fail. Cherokee Trail of Tears Bean, from my mother, 1894. I went into the main chamber and walked its full length past the log rows and the ceiling bags and the carved wall shelves, past the evidence of 30 years of Agnes's work and 30 more of my own past, the accumulated labor of 2 women who had spent their lives in service to the same living system in the same limestone mountain. I went into the back chamber and sat down against the back wall beneath the place where the small cloth book had waited for me in its wax seal for 30 years. I held the jar in my lap. The cave breathed its constant cold breath around me. The jars on the walls were quiet. The lantern I had brought cast its yellow circle over the stone floor, and the glass and the careful labels in 2 different hands, old and older, the record of what 2 people had decided was worth saving when the world was busy deciding it was not. I thought about a girl sitting on a bench under a sycamore tree, tilting her head to get the proportions right. I thought about a woman standing outside a fence, starting toward the gate and stopping, starting again. I thought about cold air on a sweating face in the 3rd day of cutting vines. I thought about what it means to clear the way for something, not to build it yourself, not to hand it to someone finished and complete, but to remove what is covering it, to do the hard work of exposure so that what was always there can be seen. Agnes had cleared the way for the cave. The cave had cleared the way for the seeds. The seeds had cleared the way for the land. And somewhere in that chain of clearings was a girl who had grown up believing she was no one's concern, discovering that she had been someone's most particular concern all along, and learning that some weights, when you finally understand what they are made of, stop feeling like burdens. They feel like foundations, and you build on them. My daughter said afterward that I looked peaceful. My son said I looked like I was home. Above the cave entrance in the limestone where Agnes had cut her name, in the year in 1913, my children added a second line the spring after I was gone. Wren Marsh Pruitt. She cleared the way. Every March now when the first green comes into Keeney's Creek Hollow and the creek runs high and cold from the snow melt, above families come from across the state to the Agnes Callaway Heritage Seed Festival on the terraces above the cabin. They bring seeds and they take seeds and they trade stories and they plant things in the old terrace ground that smell of mineral soil and mushroom compost and 30 years of mycelium working quietly below the surface. The cave still breathes behind them. The seed bank holds 640 varieties now tended by my granddaughter and a staff of 12. The mushroom operation supplies restaurants across 3 counties. And the network Agnes built, the one she called the web, the one she understood in 1931 to be not a farm but a body, runs through the soil of that hollow, still connecting root to root and stone to stone, and the living to the living and the living to what came before them. Patient and invisible and persistent, the way only underground things can be doing its work in the dark, asking for nothing except the conditions to continue.